The wind, perpetually hungry in Bitter Hollow, gnawed at the sun-baked adobe and rattled the loose planks of the general store. It was 1877, and an unforgiving land, Wyoming Territory, stretched out under a sky vast enough to swallow a man whole. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart, or for those who harbored illusions of easy living. This was a dust-bitten pocket, a collection of weary souls, miners with the permanent grit of earth under their nails, drifters running from things unseen, and those, like the elusive Elias Corbin, who simply sought to avoid the notice of anyone at all. Elias Corbin's ranch, a weathered but stout collection of log and timber, hunkered on the very edge of town, a silent sentinel against the encroaching vastness. It defied the logic of the land, requiring a tireless spirit and a deep, unspoken understanding of its brutal rhythms. Most folks in Bitter Hollow only saw Elias's broad, stooped back when he rode into town for supplies, his face perpetually hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat and a faded scarf that hugged his jaw. Whispers followed him, as they always do for men who carry such silence. Former rebbed sharper, some muttered. Seen too much, others opined, crossing themselves instinctively. The ranch, much like its owner, ran on grit and an almost unsettling quiet. The relative peace, such as it was in Bitter Hollow, was a precarious thing, built not on prosperity, but on a fragile, unspoken truce with the land itself. It was the calm before a storm, before the arrival of elements less predictable than the wind and more dangerous than a hungry wolf. Far to the east, across miles of unforgiving plains, Luella Mae Carter stood on the precipice of a new, terrifying reality. At 23, recently orphaned, her family homestead ravaged by a failed harvest and choked by unpaid debts, she had nowhere left to turn but west. She carried little: a worn satchel, a prayer, and a small silver locket that held not a picture, but a tiny, intricately carved musical mechanism. It was the only thing that remained of her mother's dreams, a melody of hope in a world increasingly devoid of it. She walked with a quiet determination, driven by a primal need for survival, a hunger for a fresh start, and a nascent yet vibrant dream of teaching poetry to children who might otherwise never know its beauty. She didn't know what awaited her in Bitter Hollow, only that it had to be better than what she left behind. Luella Mae Carter stood on the edge of Bitter Hollow, a town that seemed to have been forgotten by time, much like herself. Dust devils danced in the street, miniature tornadoes mirroring the turmoil in her gut. She'd arrived on a borrowed mare, a creature almost as bone-weary as she was, her entire worldly possessions reduced to the satchel clutched tight in her hand. The sign creaking above the saloon, the rusty spur, offered no welcome, only a stark reminder of the hard choices ahead. Her eyes scanned the dusty expanse, settling on a group of men gathered near the livery stable. They weren't the kind of men who offered comfort. Their faces were hard, their laughter coarse, and the way they watched the few women who passed spoke volumes. At their center was a man whose presence seemed to suck the air from the street Judd Cain. His smile was dazzling, almost too wide, and his eyes, though charismatic, held a glint that promised trouble. He was talking to a stooped rancher, his voice a low rumble, punctuated by the occasional jingle of spurs. Luella had heard whispers on the trail. The railroad was coming, and with it, men like Cain forcing land sales, buying up claims for next to nothing. This place, already on the brink, felt like it was holding its breath. Luella knew she couldn't offer money, as she had none. Her parents' homestead, now lost to taxes and a ruinous harvest, had taught her the bitter taste of debt. But she had strong hands, a clear head, and a desperate, burning need for a roof over her head and food in her belly. The thought of approaching someone like Cain, accepting his charity, as she'd heard it called, sent a shiver of dread down her spine. The word smelled of entrapment, of obligations that could never be repaid. Then she saw Elias Corbin. He sat astride a magnificent white Mustang, his back ramrod straight despite his quiet slump. The wide brim of his hat and the carefully draped scarf obscured most of his face, leaving only a sliver of jawline visible. He was an island of solitude in the bustling, albeit small, town. An instinct, sharp and sudden, told her this man, however private, was safer than the false charm of Judd Cain. He appeared to live by a different code, one etched in silence rather than boisterous threats. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and desperation, Luella started walking. She bypassed the general store, the saloon, and the leering men, her gaze fixed on the quiet man on the white horse. As she drew nearer, she could feel the weight of their combined stares, Cain's challenging, the other's curious. But she squared her shoulders. It was a gamble, but Luella Mae Carter had learned that in this world, sometimes the only way to survive was to choose the lesser of two fears. When she reached Elias, Mercy, the white Mustang, shifted restlessly, then settled under her master's hand. "Mr. Luella," began, her voice a little reedy but steady. "I'm Luella Carter. My family. We lost everything. I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, tend to a home. I'm not asking for charity, sir, only a chance." She watched his visible hand, scarred and large, as it rested on Mercy's mane. He didn't look at her, not directly, but she felt the intensity of his stillness. The air hummed with unspoken things. After a long moment of silence that stretched taut as a piano wire, a low, gruff voice, raspy like dry leaves, finally spoke. "Come dawn," Elias said, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. The ranch. It wasn't a welcome, not exactly, but it was an acceptance. And as Luella turned to find a place to bed down for the night, she saw Judd Cain's triumphant smile vanish, replaced by a mask of furious indignation. She had chosen. The days that followed Luella's arrival at Elias Corbin's ranch settled into a routine of quiet industry. The ranch house, once a cavern of silence, began to echo with the soft clatter of dishes, the rhythmic swish of the broom, and occasionally the hum of a forgotten tune on Luella's lips. She worked tirelessly, grateful for the shelter and food, and Elias, in turn, remained a man of few words, his presence a steady, almost comforting anchor in her turbulent new life. He would offer a gruff nod of approval over a well-cooked meal or refill her coffee cup without a prompt. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone had offered her in a very long time. Yet, an undercurrent of tension persisted, stretching beyond the ranch's relative peace into the very fabric of Bitter Hollow. Judd Cain, accustomed to getting his way, had not forgotten Luella's public defiance. His charismatic smile had quickly curdled into a sneer, and his easygoing demeanor shed to reveal the venomous snake beneath. He saw Luella's choice as a personal affront, a challenge to his burgeoning power in the territory. Cain's dogs, a motley collection of rough men drawn to his volatile charm and promises of quick wealth, had become increasingly audacious. Their strong-arming tactics, once subtle whispers in the saloon, now escalated into outright intimidation. Miners found their claims mysteriously jumped. Small homesteads were bought at ludicrously low prices, the threat of fire or worse hanging heavy in the air. The incoming railroad, once a symbol of progress and prosperity, had become a cudgel in Cain's hands, forcing land sales as he carved out his own illegal empire. He aimed to control every inch of prime land the tracks would touch, and anyone who stood in his way was a problem to be eradicated. The whispers in Bitter Hollow grew louder, laced with fear. Marion Dockley, the saloon owner with eyes that missed nothing and a mind sharp as flint, watched it all unfold from behind her polished bar. She served whiskey to Cain's men, feigned politeness to Cain himself, but deep down, a cold fury simmered. She'd seen men like him before, riding high on stolen power, leaving ruin in their wake. Her connections, reaching into the darker corners of the territory and hinting at a past she rarely spoke of, made her privy to more than just barroom gossip. She knew Cain for the cruel opportunist he was, and she harbored a quiet disdain for him, waiting for the opportune moment. One late afternoon, as Luella tended to the small garden she'd started, coaxing life from the arid soil, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust. It was Tomas Quinoa, known as Red Tom, Elias's part Shoshone horse wrangler. His quiet presence was a familiar sight, his movements as fluid and natural as the land itself. Red Tom was a living bridge to the wild, untamed spirit of the territory, carrying the ancient wisdom of his people in his steady gaze and his intuitive connection to the animals. He often shared tales, stories of a land forgotten by white men, of spirits and courage, and of the bent tree, a mythical place of reckoning. As Red Tom dismounted, his eyes met Luella's, and for the first time she saw a flicker of concern that broke through his usual calm. "Trouble brewing, Miss Luella," he murmured, his gaze shifting towards the distant town. "Cain's dogs are getting bolder. They're sniffing around parts of the land Elias holds." He didn't need to say more. The unspoken threat hung in the air, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon. The sanctuary Luella had found was not as secure as she had hoped. The silence of Elias's ranch had been a heavy blanket, insulating him from the world's harsh cacophony for over a decade. But Luella Mae Carter, unknowingly, brought a different kind of sound. It started subtly, a soft humming as she mended a shirt, the bright, clear trill of a folk tune while she kneaded dough, the faint, almost unheard, melody from her locket as she cleaned the cramped, spare room that was now hers. These were not the loud, jarring noises of the town or the haunted echoes of his memories. This was life, gentle and persistent, like a spring bubbling up from cracked earth. Elias, for his part, remained a man carved from granite. He watched her from the periphery of his vision, a silent observer. He noticed her diligence, her quiet competence, the way she hummed to herself as she coaxed a patch of stubborn soil into yielding a few hardy plants. He saw the resilience that shone in her eyes, unwavering even after a day of back-breaking work. He was accustomed to a life devoid of direct gaze, and yet Luella met his glance, even his shadowed one, with an open, unafraid honesty that disconcerted him. It chipped, ever so slightly, at the armor he'd built around himself. One particularly harsh evening, a rare break in the endless Wyoming wind, Luella sat by the small, crackling fire in the main room, mending a tear in his worn coat. Elias sat across from her, ostensibly cleaning his traps, the familiar scarf pulled high. Without thinking, or perhaps because the silence felt too vast, Luella's fingers sought the musical locket at her throat. It opened with a soft click, and a delicate, almost ethereal melody filled the small space. It was a lullaby, sweet and sorrowful, a song from childhood. Elias froze. The oil rag slipped from his hand. The sound, so pure and vulnerable, pierced through the layers of his self-imposed isolation. He looked up, truly looked, and for the first time, Luella saw past the guard, past the stoicism, to a profound sadness in his eyes. He didn't rebuke her, didn't comment, but a subtle shift had occurred. A crack had appeared in the granite. Days turned into weeks, and the seasons began their slow, inevitable march. As the early whispers of winter began to stir the landscape, Luella fell into a rhythm of work and quiet observation. She noticed Elias's quiet kindness, the way he would leave a piece of particularly good jerky for her, or ensure the firewood was always stacked high. But she also saw the deep-seated melancholy that clung to him, a shadow even on the brightest days. One afternoon, Red Tom arrived with the news that Cain's men were pushing ever nearer, harassing lone prospectors on the outskirts of Elias's claim. The conversation in the bunkhouse that night was, for Elias, unusual in its length. He spoke of the war, not in detail, but in vague, haunted terms, and Luella listened. As the last embers of the fire glowed, casting long, dancing shadows, Elias finally lowered his scarf, just slightly. A jagged, angry scar marred the left side of his face, pulling his eye in a disfigured slat. It was truly shocking, a testament to unimaginable trauma. He spoke, his voice rough, of a dying battlefield, of a child, no older than 6, caught between retreating lines. He had seen the terror in the boy's eyes, the impossible choice. He rushed forward, a final, reckless act of defiance against the senseless destruction. He saved the boy, but the resulting explosion, The shrapnel reshaped his face, and with it, his vision of himself. The betrayal wasn't just of his body, but of his soul, a war that demanded such cruelty, only to leave him broken for an act of pure, desperate compassion. He finished, the words hanging heavy in the air, then pulled the scarf back up, retreating behind his customary veil. But Luella, looking at his profile, felt no revulsion. Instead, a profound wave of understanding, and something akin to a fierce protectiveness, washed over her. She saw not a scarred face, but a man who had sacrificed himself for another. The revelation of Elias's scar, whispered in the flickering firelight, had been a shattering moment for Luella. It wasn't just a disfigurement. It was a physical manifestation of a profound internal wound, a testament to a life-altering act of compassion in the midst of senseless brutality. Her gaze lingered on him, not with pity, but with a fierce, burgeoning respect. The quiet, stoic rancher was not merely an outcast. He was a man who carried the heavy burden of a hidden heroism, a kindness that had cost him dear. He had revealed it as much to himself as to her, a crack in the carefully constructed wall he'd maintained for years. And though he retreated back behind his scarf, the air between them had shifted, infused now with a deeper understanding. Luella, with an intuitive grace that belied her young age, left him space, but her actions spoke volumes. Her meals were always warm and ready, her presence a quiet comfort in the shared silence. She observed him, noting the subtle flinch when a loud noise echoed from the distance, the way his hand instinctively went to the faded scar beneath the cloth. She understood, without words, the ghosts that haunted him. Meanwhile, the shadow of Judd Cain stretched longer over Bitter Hollow. The whispers Red Tom had relayed quickly escalated to violent aggressions. Elias's ranch, a secluded haven, became a target. One blustery night, shots peppered the walls of the bunkhouse, narrowly missing Red Tom and his handful of wranglers. A week later, a storage shed, filled with their carefully gathered winter feed and dried meat, was set ablaze, its contents reduced to smoldering ash and bitter smoke. The message was clear, scrawled in blood on the water trough. "Move on, Corbin." Elias stood amidst the charred remains of his winter stores, his face unreadable beneath the hat's brim. The silence that had once defined his chosen solitude now felt heavy, oppressive, filled with the unspoken threat of further violence. He had built this life, carved it out of the harsh Wyoming land with his own two hands, but the war had left him with a deep-seated weariness that made the thought of a renewed battle almost unbearable. He had fled one war, and the thought of being dragged into another, even for his own home, was a crushing weight. Luella found him later, sitting on the porch, staring out at the ravaged landscape. The very air around him seemed to sag with defeat. "Maybe it's time, Luella," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual gruffness. "Time to let it go. There's other land. Further north, maybe." Luella, however, had found something here, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she craved. She thought of the fragile garden, the promise of spring, and the quiet understanding shared with this guarded man. She thought of Judd Cain, his cruel eyes and manipulative charm, and a steel resolve hardened in her. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "I won't let him win. I'd rather die out here with dignity than crawl back to someone like Judd." There was a fierce, protective glint in her eyes, a reflection of the courage Elias himself possessed but had long buried. Later that evening, Red Tom found Elias in the stable, running a hand over Mercy's glistening coat. He spoke softly, not of Cain's threats, but of something deeper. "My people have a tale, Elias," he said, his voice melodic, resonant with ancient wisdom. "A place, once sacred, where the world was set right not with blood, but with courage." Red Tom paused, his gaze meeting Elias's with a profound knowing. "Your soul, Elias, it needs reclaiming." The charred timbers of the storage shed still smoldered, a bitter scent clinging to the crisp morning air. Elias stood among the wreckage, the weight of the destruction pressing down on him. His weariness was palpable, a physical manifestation of years spent fighting battles, then retreating from them. The war may have ended, but its scars, physical and emotional, continued to wage their own quiet campaigns within him. Luella's defiant outburst a few days prior, her refusal to capitulate to Cain, her insistence on dignity, even in destitution, had stirred something within him, a flicker of forgotten purpose. But the path forward remained shrouded. It was Red Tom who brought the light. He found Elias in the stable, running a soothing hand over Mercy's flank. The mustang, sensing its master's turmoil, nickered softly. Red Tom's presence was always calming, a quiet counterpoint to the restless clamor of the world. He moved with the effortless grace of one deeply connected to the land, his every action infused with a patient understanding. "The fire speaks volumes, Elias," Red Tom began, his voice low, resonant. He spoke in riddles often, in metaphors drawn from the vastness of the natural world, but his meaning was always clear to Elias. "It tries to burn away the roots, to leave nothing but ash." Elias merely grunted, still contemplating retreat. The idea of uprooting again, of abandoning the solitary life he had painstakingly built, was almost tempting in its seeming simplicity. But then he remembered Luella's brave stand, her unwavering gaze, and the delicate locket that pulsed with the quiet rhythm of hope. "My people have a tale," Red Tom continued, as if sensing the battle within Elias. He settled onto a bale of hay, his gaze fixed on the stable door, picturing the sagebrush plains beyond. "Long ago, in the pinny hills that border these badlands, there was a place, a gorge, deep and winding, where a mighty old cottonwood grew, its trunk bent almost to the ground by countless seasons of wind and snow. But it never broke." Elias, for all his gruffness, was always attentive when Red Tom spoke of the old ways. There was a wisdom there, a connection to something ancient and enduring that transcended the harsh realities of their present. The Shoshone believed this place, this bent tree gorge, was sacred. Red Tom went on, his voice taking on a narrative cadence. It was where wrongs were righted, not always through violence, but through courage. It was a place for reckoning, for facing the truth of oneself, and for making a stand for what was just. He paused, letting the words hang in the still air of the stable. "Sometimes a man builds walls around himself, thicker than any fort, to keep the pain out. But those walls, they also keep out the wonder, the joy, the fight for what is right. They keep out the truth, that scar. It is a mark of courage, Elias, not shame." Red Tom rose, brushing hay from his leather pants. "Your soul, Elias, it needs reclaiming. You have found a reason. That woman. She brings the song back into the silent places. What will you do with it?" His words were not a demand, but an invitation to step out from behind the veil of self-imposed exile, to reclaim the fiercely just man he had once been. The Shoshone tale was a call to arms, not for bloodshed, but for the moral courage to fight for something more than just survival. It was a catalyst, igniting a spark in Elias that had long lain dormant, promising a path towards redemption not only for himself, but for Bitter Hollow. The image of Luella's unwavering gaze, her determined spirit, intertwined with Red Tom's ancient prophecy, settled into Elias's core. The question was no longer if he would fight, but how. The air had been thick with unspoken tension since Red Tom's prophecy of the bent tree. Elias had found a renewed, almost fierce purpose, a resolve hardened by Luella's unwavering courage and Red Tom's ancient wisdom. He spent his days quietly mending the ranch, but his movements were different now. There was an electric alertness, a readiness in his every step. The whispers of the past still haunted him, but they no longer consumed him. He was sharpening, preparing, though for what, he wasn't yet certain. Then at dawn, it happened. A sound, brutal and jarring, ripped through the morning's serenity. Not the crack of a single shot, but a volley of gunfire, followed by the shouts of men and the panicked whinny of horses. Elias, already awake, was out of the bunkhouse in seconds, his rifle in hand, his heart a hammer against his ribs. He saw it immediately, a whirlwind of dust and chaos near the main house. 3 of Cain's dogs, their faces obscured by bandanas, were dragging Luella Mae Carter towards their horses. She fought, a defiant, furious strength in her small frame, kicking and clawing, her musical locket flying from her neck and landing unseen in the dust. Her cries, sharp and desperate, tore through the chilled morning air. Elias. Before Elias could fully react, one of the outlaws, a burly man named Silas, struck her across the head with the butt of his rifle. Luella crumpled, a limp bundle, and was hoisted onto the back of a horse, tied securely. The outlaws, with a final, mocking yell aimed at the approaching Elias, spurred their horses and vanished into the swirling dust, leaving behind a profound, terrifying silence. Elias sprinted towards the house, his sharpshooter's instinct screaming betrayal. He'd been too slow. He'd let them take her. A cold, vengeful fury, long dormant, surged through him, extinguishing everything else. On the porch, he found the earth disturbed, a small, glinting object half buried in the dust. Luella's locket. He stooped, his large fingers carefully closing around it. It was still warm from her skin. He turned, the locket clenched tight, and his gaze fell upon something else, something he hadn't noticed in the frantic chaos. A piece of parchment, torn and dirtied, partially covered by a loose rock. It was a map, crude but detailed, depicting a familiar stretch of land, marked with faded ink and faint pencil lines. Elias recognized it immediately, the location of Luella's parents' former homestead. His eyes scanned the map, quickly deciphering the symbols. Hidden amongst the family's abandoned claim were markings, crude but undeniable, indicating a silver vein, a vein Judd Cain would undoubtedly want to control. Why had Luella kept this? Had she known? This wasn't just about reclaiming a defiant woman. It was about something far, far greater. Cain had taken her, not just out of spite, but because he likely suspected her connection to the land, to its potential riches. Luella's desperate wander westward wasn't just a flight from death. It was a path leading her directly into the heart of Cain's greed. The choice, once an agonizing internal struggle, now crystallized into stark, undeniable clarity. Continue to hide in grief, shrouded in the safety of his self-imposed exile, and let Luella be consumed by Cain's wickedness? Or rise up, shed the weight of the past, and fight for the future that Luella, with her quiet strength and vibrant spirit, had dared to dream, a future for Bitter Hollow, and perhaps for himself? He looked at the locket in his hand, then at the map. The answer resonated in his very bones. The old ways, the solitude, they were gone. He moved with a new sense of purpose, his steps firm and resolute. He walked into the bunkhouse, ignoring the stunned faces of Red Tom and the ranch hands. With deliberate movements, he pulled out his old war chest. From its depths, he drew out the worn leather coat, its once gray color faded by sun and rain. He tied on the familiar scarf, not now to hide, but to prepare. Finally, his hand closed around the cold, familiar weight of his old revolver, a weapon he hadn't touched in a decade. He walked out, transformed. He swung himself onto Mercy's back, the white Mustang seeming to sense the shift in his master, its muscles rippling with readiness. Elias Corbin, the scarred rancher, was no longer retreating. He was riding out, not just to rescue Luella, but to confront the darkness that had descended upon Bitter Hollow. The dust from Judd Cain's retreating riders still swirled in the early morning light, but the chaos and panic had cleared, replaced by an icy resolve in Elias. The sight of Luella being snatched, her desperate cries echoing across the ranch, had shattered the last vestiges of his self-imposed isolation. His immediate instinct, honed by years of conflict, was to pursue, to rescue. But then, as he knelt to examine the scuff marks where Luella had been dragged, his eyes caught the glint of something in the disturbed earth, Luella's locket. He scooped it up, the cool metal a stark contrast to the burning rage in his chest. Nearby, A piece of old parchment, dislodged by the struggle, lay half-buried beneath a loose stone. He picked it up, his gaze drawn to the faded lines and crude markings. It was a map, clearly hand-drawn, depicting a familiar stretch of the territory. Elias recognized the landmarks, the meandering creek, the distinctive rise of the hills. His breath caught. It was the land where Luella's homestead had once stood, the parcel her parents had lost to unpaid taxes. But it wasn't just a simple property map. Scattered across the diagram, marked with amateurish but unmistakable crosses, were notations that sent a jolt through him. Elias muttered aloud, tracing a finger over a series of X's near what appeared to be an old, disused mine shaft. A silver vein. A rich silver vein, if these crude markings were to be believed. The same vein Cain had been trying to get his hands on, the reason behind his violent acquisition of land parcels around Bitter Hollow. This was why Cain had taken Luella, not merely out of spite for her rejecting his hospitality, but because he suspected her connection to this land, to its hidden wealth. He must have somehow learned about the potential silver, perhaps through old land records or a careless word, and then connected it to Luella's orphan status as the last surviving heir. This wasn't just about intimidation or flexing power. It was about outright theft, disguised as an ongoing dispute. The revelation was a hammer blow, driving away any lingering doubt. Elias had seen enough greed in his life to recognize its insidious grip. He knew, with chilling clarity, that if Cain acquired this land, he would destroy anyone and anything that stood in his way, including Luella. The future she had hinted at, a future of poetry and gentler things, would be crushed under the weight of Cain's savage ambition. A profound choice lay before him, stark and undeniable. He could continue to live in the protective shell he had built around himself, letting the ghosts of his past dictate his present. He could let Cain win, let Luella be swallowed by the darkness of the Badlands, and retreat further into his isolated world. Or he could shed the grief, rise up, and fight for the future that only Luella had dared to dream. The choice was not just for her, but for Bitter Hollow, for the promise of a better, more just world. Elias looked at the locket in his hand, its small musical mechanism, a fragile reminder of beauty and hope. He looked at the map, tracing the X's that marked a new battleground. The decision solidified, hardened into an unyielding resolve. This was a battle he would fight. With purposeful strides, Elias strode towards the bunkhouse. He ignored Red Tom's questioning gaze, the other ranch hands whispering in confusion. From a forgotten trunk beneath his cot, he pulled out his old war gear. The heavy, faded coat, still carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and rain. The worn leather of his belt that once held his canteens and pouches. And finally, the cold, familiar weight of his old revolver, a relic of a past he had sought to bury. He pulled the scarf tighter around his face, but now it was not to hide, but to prepare for what lay ahead. Mounting Mercy, Elias cast a final glance at the ranch, a home that had brought him unexpected peace, and now a renewed sense of purpose. With a firm, quiet command, he spurred Mercy into a gallop. His destination, the Bent Tree Gorge, that ancient place of reckoning where, as Red Tom promised, wrongs would be righted. The pre-dawn light painted the jagged peaks of the Bent Tree Gorge in stark shades of gray and purple. A frigid wind, cutting sharper than any blade, whistled through the narrow canyons, carrying the scent of pine and something else, the unmistakable tang of wood smoke and uncouth men. Elias Corbin, astride Mercy, surveyed the scene below him. Cain's camp, a cluster of rough tents and tethered horses, sat nestled by a small, churning river. He counted 6 men, including Judd Cain himself, identifiable even from this distance by his swagger. And there, tied to a lone, gnarled cottonwood, the very bent tree of Red Tom's tale, was Luella Mae Carter. A cold certainty settled in Elias. This was it. The reckoning. He was no longer the haunted recluse, the man hiding from his past. The weight of his old army coat felt right, the familiar grip of his revolver a comfort, not a burden. He dismounted, leaving Mercy hidden among the rocks, a silent promise of escape should he fail. Then he began his descent, a solitary figure against the vast, awakening wilderness. He moved with the practiced stealth of a predator, a skill honed on 100 battlefields. Every rock, every shadow was an ally. He bypassed the sleeping sentry, his movements fluid, deadly quiet. He reached the edge of their encampment, the sounds of rough snores and crackling fire growing louder. He drew his revolver, the metallic click barely audible above the wind. Elias's voice, raw and unyielding, echoed through the gorge, startling the sleeping men. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of a decade of silence and the promise of impending justice. Judd Cain scrambled from his bedroll, his features contorted in groggy confusion, then narrowing into a sneer as he recognized Elias. He snarled, disbelief warring with rage. "You got guts, old man." His men, roused by the commotion, began fanning out, reaching for their weapons. The showdown began. It was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a brutal, calculated dance. Elias, with his sharpshooting precision, moved like a phantom, firing only when necessary, his targets always disarmed, never killed. A shot rang out, and a pistol flew from one man's hand, clattering against the rocks. Another, and a rifle was sent spinning into the river. He wasn't fighting to simply survive. He was fighting to protect, to leave them alive to understand the true measure of their cruelty. His aim was surgical, striking weapons, not flesh, a testament to his controlled fury. Cain's men, disoriented and panicking under the barrage of precise, non-lethal shots from their unseen tormentor, began to fall back, shouting in confusion. Judd Cain, realizing the extent of Elias's skill, seized Luella. He yanked her to her feet, holding a knife to her throat, dragging her towards the precipice of the gorge, a sheer drop into the churning waters below. Cain's voice was hoarse with desperation, a thin veneer over his true fear. "One more move, and she goes over." Elias stepped out from the shadows, his revolver still in his hand, but held loosely, almost reluctantly. "Let her go, Cain," he stated, his voice calm, yet edged with an authority that left no room for doubt. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Elias Corbin reached up and pulled down his scarf. The jagged, disfigured landscape of his face was revealed in the harsh light of dawn, a roadmap of past trauma, stark and exposed. Luella gasped, a small, choked sound. She had only seen it in the muted lamplight of the bunkhouse. Seeing it now, etched by the unforgiving light of morning, was another blow. But for Elias, it was an act of profound vulnerability, an offering. "Here," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly across the gorge. He dropped his revolver to the ground with a thud, a metallic echo in the silence. He raised his empty hands, a gesture of surrender that was anything but. "You want tribute, Cain? Take it. This face. This life. It's been a prison. You want it? Take it." He offered the one thing Judd Cain, a man motivated by greed and power, could never understand: mercy. A life for a life, not in blood, but in soul. The silence that followed Elias's act of disarming himself, of revealing his scarred face, was absolute. Even the relentless wind of the gorge seemed to hold its breath. Judd Cain stared, his eyes flicking from Luella, still trembling in his grasp, to Elias's exposed profile, a look of confusion warring with his ingrained arrogance. The offer of mercy was a foreign concept to him, a weakness he couldn't comprehend. He tightened his grip on Luella, pulling her closer to the crumbling edge of the cliff. Cain scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "There's no mercy out here, old man. Only strength. And I got it." He took a step closer to the edge, Luella's gasp audible. "Now, where's that map, Corbin? The one that tells me where all the silver is?" Elias stood his ground, unmoving, his gaze unwavering. "You'll never have it, Judd," he said, his voice steady. "Not from me. Not from her. You don't understand. This isn't about strength." Enraged, and perhaps sensing his control slipping, Judd decided to end the confrontation. With a guttural roar, he shoved Luella roughly aside and charged Elias, his fists clenched, a wild, desperate fury in his eyes. He lunged, aiming for Elias's head, but Elias, despite his age and old wounds, moved with an unexpected swiftness. As Cain closed the distance, Luella, still disoriented but regaining her footing, saw it. The glint of metal where it had fallen from her locket, right at Judd's charging feet. Instinctively, she screamed, "Judd!" A last, desperate warning. But it was too late. Cain's foot connected with the small, mirrored locket, sending it skittering across the rock, directly into his line of sight. As he stumbled forward, the small, circular mirror caught the harsh dawn light, reflecting his own enraged face, and then a familiar, tiny, engraved image. A name almost invisible to the naked eye. Sarah. Judd froze. His momentum carried him forward, but his eyes were locked on the locket, then on Elias, a dawning horror creeping into his expression. He whispered, his voice cracking, devoid of its usual bluster. He stooped, his hands trembling as he picked up the locket. It was his sister's. Sarah, killed years ago in a railroad accident. An accident he had caused in his reckless youth, pushing for faster track laying, corners cut to meet deadlines as a railroad enforcer. Elias saw the flicker of comprehension in Cain's eyes. She would have lived, Judd, Elias said, his voice low, filled with a quiet sorrow that pierced through Cain's hardened exterior. If you hadn't been so hungry for the next dollar, for the next mile of track. The truth, stark and brutal, landed like a physical blow. The manipulation, the charisma, the ruthless ambition, it all crumbled. Judd Cain collapsed to his knees, utterly defeated, not by Elias's strength, but by the weight of his own forgotten sin, laid bare by a simple, forgotten trinket. He had buried that guilt, building an empire of fear and greed on top of it, but now it had risen from the depths, an inescapable ghost. Just then, the sound of horses and shouting reached the gorge. Marion Dockley, her usually calm demeanor replaced by an expression of grim determination, rode into the camp at the head of a posse. Miners, homesteaders, and townsfolk, tired of Cain's bullying, had answered her quiet summons. She had rallied them, their anger finally eclipsing their fear. Marion's voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the stunned silence. Her eyes, cold and unwavering, fixed on the broken man on the ground. The remaining members of Cain's dogs, seeing their leader a shattered wreck and facing a determined, armed populace, quickly surrendered. The dawn light, once a harsh witness to violence, now bathed the scene in the gentle glow of justice finally delivered. Luella, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound relief, ran to Elias. He met her, pulling his hand away from the scarf, allowing his face to remain exposed. The battle was over. The dust from the bent tree gorge had barely settled, and the echoes of the confrontation still lingered in the air. But a new dawn had broken over Bitter Hollow. With Judd Cain and his remaining gang now in the custody of Marion Dockley's impromptu posse, a palpable sense of relief, a collective exhale, swept through the town. The fear that had gripped the community for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, then rising wave of hope. Cain's plans to strong-arm the land for his own greedy gain crumbled faster than a dry riverbed in summer. The railroad, once a symbol of his corrupt influence, became a catalyst for legitimate growth. The discovery of the silver vein on Luella's family homestead, confirmed by Elias with his hidden land patent, meant that the land was no longer just a target for exploitation, but a key to Bitter Hollow's prosperity. The railroad agreement was revised, ensuring fair dealings, and the true wealth of the territory could now benefit the community rather than line one man's pockets. 2 seasons later, Bitter Hollow was a town transformed. The dust still blew, and the winters were still harsh, but the atmosphere hummed with a different kind of energy. New businesses sprang up, genuine prospects lured by the promise of honest work and a fair shake. Miners, no longer fearing intimidation, worked their claims with renewed vigor. The most visible sign of this new era was the small, sturdy schoolhouse that now stood proudly at the edge of town, its freshly painted door a vibrant splash of blue against the muted landscape. Inside, eager young faces looked up at their teacher, Luella Mae Carter. Her voice, once a quiet hum, now filled the room with the rhythmic beauty of poetry and the clear, gentle cadence of learning. She had found her calling, her dream of teaching blossoming in the most unlikely of places. The musical locket, now securely fastened around her neck, often resonated with a happy tune as she guided her students through their lessons. And Elias, the scarred rancher, he no longer wore the scarf to hide his face, though he still favored the wide-brimmed hat. The scar remained, a testament to his past, but now it was a badge of courageous sacrifice, not a mark of shame. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was different, filled with a quiet contentment. He and Luella had married in a simple ceremony, standing before Marion Dockley, with Red Tom as their witness. Their union was a testament to the unexpected beauty that could bloom from hardship and shared courage. Elias had poured his energy into repairing Luella's old family homestead, not for the silver, which was being worked by responsible hands under a fair agreement, but to truly honor her dreams. It became more than just a home. In a few short months, the once abandoned house was reopened as the Bent Tree Refuge, a sanctuary Elias had quietly conceived. War orphans, children left adrift and scarred by the conflict that had marked his own soul, found a safe haven there, alongside other outcast folk seeking a fresh start. Red Tom, with a knowing smile, had officially bestowed the name, honoring the tale that had inspired Elias to reclaim his soul. The sun dipped below the rugged horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft purples. On the porch of their rebuilt ranch, now renamed the Bent Tree Refuge, Elias sat with Luella, her head resting on his shoulder. Her soft humming filled the twilight, a melody of peace and belonging. The ranch stretched out before them, a living testament to resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary power of an unexpected love. They say the scarred rancher turned his back on the world, a recluse haunted by the echoes of a brutal past. But then a woman arrived, with nothing but a song in her heart, a dream in her spirit, and an unwavering belief in dignity. She traded it all for shelter, for a roof over her head, and in return she gave him everything he thought he didn't deserve: a home, a purpose, and a future brighter than he had ever dared to dream.